Hey guys, tonight we step into the shadows of history. A world where crowns gleamed in candlelight, but daggers gleamed sharper in the dark. Where kings, emperors, and generals believed they held destiny in their fists, until one silent hand reached from the shadows and stole it away. This is not the history of armies marching, banners waving, or speeches echoing through marble halls. This is the history of whispers, of betrayals, of blades hidden beneath cloaks. This is the story of the assassins of the ancient world. From the crowded marketplaces of Jerusalem, where robed men blended into the crowd before striking like serpents, to the mountain fortresses of Persia, where fanatics pledged their lives to a master who sent them into death with only a dagger and a promise of paradise. History has always been written not only by victors, but by shadows. Armies may win empires, but assassins decide who lives long enough to rule them. Imagine it. You're a king, seated on a throne of gold, adored by thousands, feared by more. Yet every time you lift a goblet to your lips, you wonder if the wine has been touched by poison. Every time you walk through your palace, you wonder if the footsteps behind you belong to a servant or a killer. Every time you embrace a trusted friend, you wonder if the dagger he carries is meant for your enemies or for your heart. This is the reality of the ancient world. Power was never safe, thrones were never secure, and the most dangerous soldiers in history often carried no shield, no armor, no army, only a blade, a vial, and the patience to strike when no one expected it. Take Philip II of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great. A man who built an empire through brilliance and ruthlessness, only to fall in a moment at a wedding, his bodyguard's dagger ending his reign and setting the stage for his son to change the world. Or the Hashshashin, cloaked in shadows atop the fortress of Alamut, who turned assassination into a weapon of terror, killing not to destroy armies, but to destroy the very will of nations. Or the Sicarii, dagger-men of Jerusalem, who slipped through crowds to stab Romans and collaborators in broad daylight, making every street a battlefield. And that is only the beginning. In the courts of Persia, poison and betrayal became tools of statecraft, kings rising and falling in cycles of blood. In India, the art of assassination blended with strategy, where poison maidens and hidden blades reshaped dynasties. And in Rome, Rome, the emperors who declared, themselves gods, discovered that the only throne more dangerous than power itself was the one guarded by their own soldiers. What makes this journey chilling is not just the killings themselves, but the intimacy of them. Armies kill from afar, faceless and nameless, but an assassin kills up close. A dagger slips between ribs, a vial of poison touches lips. A trusted guard, a loyal friend, a beloved wife. Anyone could be the hand of death. And when the blade falls, it changes not just a life, but the course of empires. History remembers emperors, queens, and kings. But tonight, we will remember the shadows. The assassins who made and unmade empires, who turned rulers into corpses, and who taught the world that power is never safe. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to Dead Men's History for Sleep, and stay with us till the very end. Because hidden in these tales lies a truth that history rarely tells. A truth about fear, about ambition, and about the blades that shaped destiny. Only the sharpest eyes will see it. So grab your popcorn, lie back, let the lights fade, and listen. Tonight, you will hear of kings who were struck down at the height of their glory, of empires undone not by armies but by single hands, and of assassins whose names live on not in monuments, but in whispers. The assassins of the ancient world are waiting, and their stories begin now. The world remembers Alexander the Great, the boy who carved empires out of empires, the conqueror who wept when there were no more lands to conquer. But behind every legend lies another shadow, and in this case, it was his father. Philip II of Macedon was the architect of the empire Alexander would inherit, the man who turned a fractured kingdom into a war machine that shook Greece to its core. His name, though often forgotten, belongs among the most dangerous and cunning figures in history. When Philip was born, Macedonia was no jewel of civilization. To the proud Greeks of Athens and Sparta, Macedonians were little more than barbarians, shepherds with crowns, rough men with no refinement. Their kings were unstable, their armies weak, their throne often taken not by inheritance, but by daggers in the dark. The court of Macedon was soaked in betrayal. A king could scarcely warm the throne before his own relatives plotted against him. It was into this world of blood and uncertainty that Philip opened his eyes. Fate dealt him an unusual hand. As a teenager, he was taken hostage and carried off to Thebes, the great city of Greece. To most, this would have been humiliation. But Philip turned captivity into education. In the house of Epaminondas, the most brilliant general of his age, he watched and listened. He studied the Theban phalanx, a formation of soldiers, shoulder to shoulder, their spears like a living wall of death. He absorbed not only the art of war, but the subtlety of politics, the truth that alliances could be deadlier than armies, and betrayal more powerful than a sword. By the time Philip returned to Macedonia, he was no longer a hostage. He was a strategist in disguise, carrying in his mind the seeds of revolution. The kingdom he returned to was on the brink of ruin. Enemies pressed from every border: Illyrians, Thracians, Greeks. His elder brother had been killed, leaving the throne contested and weak. Chaos hung over Macedon like a storm cloud. But Philip was not the kind of man to be consumed by chaos. He was the kind of man who learned to ride it. At first, he ruled only as regent for his infant nephew, a child too young to wear the crown. But within months, Philip had maneuvered with skill and ruthlessness, seizing the throne for himself. He was king not because fate had placed a crown on his head, but because he had stolen it before anyone else could. Once on the throne, he wasted no time. The army of Macedonia, once a rabble of peasants and half-trained warriors, became his forge. Philip lengthened the spears of his soldiers, creating a new kind of phalanx that could outreach the Greeks. He drilled them day and night until they moved like a single creature, an iron beast whose steps thundered across the battlefield. His men were no longer farmers with swords. They were professionals, hardened, disciplined, loyal to their king. But Philip's genius was not only military. He understood that blades could conquer territory, but silver could conquer hearts. He bribed, seduced, and blackmailed Greek politicians, weaving webs of influence in Athens and Thebes. He used marriage as a weapon, taking wives not for love, but for alliances, each union tying him to another powerful house, another rival neutralized. In a few short years, the man who had once been a forgotten hostage had transformed Macedonia into the most formidable force in Greece. Yet for Philip, power was never secure. Every ally could turn traitor, every banquet could hide poison, every shadow could conceal an assassin. And in Macedonia, history had shown again and again, it was often those closest to the throne who struck first. Philip lived with daggers in the dark, and one day, one of them would find him. Philip's reign gathered momentum like a storm rolling over the mountains. The Greeks to the south still dismissed him at first, calling him a barbarian king from a land of shepherds. They had no idea that within a few short years, this so-called barbarian would be dictating the fate of every Greek city-state. Philip knew how to strike fear, but he also knew how to whisper promises. When he marched against the Illyrians, he crushed them so decisively that Macedonia's borders were secured for the first time in generations. His soldiers, once mocked as peasants, returned hardened, carrying not just spoils of war, but the confidence that they served a king who could lead them to glory. From then on, when Philip spoke, they followed. His army became an extension of his will, but the battlefield was only one of his arenas. In Greece, politics was blood sport, and Philip played it better than anyone. Athens might roar with speeches about liberty, but Philip silenced those voices with silver. Politicians who opposed him one day found their purses mysteriously heavy the next. Rival kings who threatened him suddenly became in-laws when Philip married into their houses. He used his own family as chess pieces, each bride and each child securing another foothold in the deadly game of power. And he was ruthless when diplomacy failed. In Thrace, he campaigned like a predator, burning villages, enslaving thousands, and planting garrisons like seeds of conquest. He seized control of gold and silver mines, pouring endless wealth into Macedonia's coffers. With that wealth, he paid his soldiers well, ensured their loyalty, and funded the machines of war that would grind down any who resisted him. Still, not all of Greece bowed so easily. Thebes had once been Philip's prison, and now it stood as both rival and reminder. Sparta still carried the pride of its warriors, though its power had waned. Athens remained a lion with sharp words, its orators filling the air with warnings against the rising Macedonian king. One voice in particular, the orator Demosthenes, thundered against Philip in speech after speech, calling him a menace a tyrant cloaked in cunning. But while Demosthenes spoke, Philip acted. He advanced step by step, never rushing, always patient. Each battle he chose was calculated, each treaty designed to weaken one city while drawing another into his orbit. Where Greeks fought each other, Philip smiled. He was the spider in the center of the web, pulling every thread tighter until no city-state could move without brushing against his power. His army marched further, his phalanx rolling like an unstoppable tide. But behind the banners and victories, danger lingered. Macedonia's court was still a place of treachery. Relatives watched him with envy. Ambitious nobles whispered of his growing power. Every banquet, every toast carried the chance of betrayal. Philip had survived daggers before, and he would again, but he knew that no king in Macedonia ever sat on the throne without the shadow of murder stretching across it. Still, he pressed on. Greece was nearly within his grasp, and Philip, the man who had risen from hostage to king, was ready to claim not just Macedonia, but the destiny of all Greece. Philip's shadow stretched further with every passing year. By now, he was no longer the underestimated barbarian king of Macedon, but the master strategist whose name was spoken in every Greek city. His phalanx was feared, his coffers overflowing with gold from Thrace, and his enemies were running out of time. The Athenians tried to resist him with words, their orators filling the assembly with thunder. Demosthenes shouted that Philip was a serpent creeping into Greece, poisoning freedom, preparing to strangle the very breath of democracy. His speeches stirred the people, but speeches alone could not stop the steady march of Macedonian steel. Philip knew how to play a longer game than words. He dangled peace treaties before his enemies, lured them into false security, then struck when their guard was lowered. He captured key cities, each one another lock on the chain binding Greece to him. When necessary, he used his army with ruthless efficiency. When not, he used bribes, marriages, and promises of safety. By the time Athens realized the depth of his ambition, it was already too late. The final reckoning came at Chaeronea in 338 BC. On one side stood the combined forces of Athens and Thebes, allies who had buried their rivalries out of fear of Philip. On the other stood Philip himself, commanding veterans who had marched with him through blood and fire for years. And at his side, his teenage son Alexander. The battle was brutal, the plain trembling under the clash of phalanxes. Philip himself led the left wing, retreating just enough to lure the Athenians forward in overconfidence. On the right, young Alexander commanded the cavalry. At the decisive moment, Philip held the enemy in place while Alexander led a thunderous charge that shattered the Thebans' sacred band, an elite unit once considered invincible. The Greeks fought with desperation, but they were crushed. Chaeronea was not just a battle, it was a funeral for Greek independence. The city-states that had once boasted of liberty, that had once defied Persia and carved their own legends, were now forced to kneel. Philip did not destroy them outright. He was too clever for that. Instead, he created the League of Corinth, binding them all under his leadership, presenting himself not as conqueror, but as protector, the man who would unite them against a greater enemy, Persia. To the Greeks, it was submission disguised as alliance. To Philip, it was brilliance. He had transformed a fractured Greece into a weapon aimed outward. But even in triumph, the shadows crept closer. His court seethed with jealous nobles. His many wives, married for alliances, had birthed sons who now saw themselves as rivals. The very system of marriages and alliances that had expanded his influence also planted seeds of betrayal. Alexander, still young but already a warrior, was both Philip's heir and his challenge. Brilliant, arrogant, hungry for glory, he clashed with his father more than once. Their rivalry grew as others whispered, fanning the flames. Some said Alexander thought his father was stealing all the greatness meant for him. Others said Philip saw too much of himself in the boy and could not bear it. And yet, for all the enemies, all the plots, Philip stood unbroken. He had crushed armies, silenced orators, bent Greece to his will. Now he prepared for the crowning glory of his reign, an invasion of Persia itself. With Greece united behind him, he dreamed of marching east, of finishing what the Greeks had begun generations earlier under Alexander's namesake. But the greater his dream, the sharper the daggers around him became. For in Macedonia, kings did not often die old and peaceful. They died at feasts, on the steps of temples, in the arms of those they trusted most. Philip was too clever not to know this, yet even he could not see how close the blade was. Philip stood at the height of his power, yet the higher a king climbed, the thinner the air became, and the sharper the daggers around him. Macedonia was no longer a fragile kingdom mocked by Greece. It was a fortress of power, feared and respected across the world. The gold of Thrace poured into Philip's coffers. His army stood unrivaled, and the League of Corinth had crowned him as the supreme commander for the coming invasion of Persia. To the world, he was invincible, but inside his own court, the cracks were widening. Philip had always used marriage as a weapon, collecting wives like alliances. But the tangled web it wove would prove fatal. His queen Olympias, fierce and unpredictable, was mother to Alexander. She burned with ambition for her son, convinced that he was destined for greatness. Yet when Philip took a new bride, Cleopatra Eurydice, a young Macedonian noblewoman, Olympias seethed with fury. This was not just another political union. This was a threat. A Macedonian-born queen could give Philip a new heir, one with purer blood in the eyes of the nobles, a rival who might eclipse Alexander. The court grew tense, whispers turning into open conflict. At the wedding banquet of Philip and Cleopatra Eurydice, a drunken relative toasted that the king would now have legitimate heirs. Alexander, enraged, hurled a cup at the man and shouted at his father in front of the entire court. Philip, equally drunk, rose in anger, sword in hand, and stumbled toward his son. But fate mocked him. He tripped and fell to the ground, sprawled helpless before the very boy he had threatened. Alexander, humiliated, left the hall with Olympias, and for a time the bond between father and son was shattered. Still, Philip pressed forward with his grand design. Persia awaited, rich and fractured after years of weak kings. With his new pan-Hellenic army, Philip dreamed of carving out an empire even greater than Greece had ever known. He prepared for the invasion meticulously, gathering resources, rallying allies, and planning a campaign that would outshine every conquest before him. To many, he already stood as the greatest king of his age. But triumph does not silence envy. Within the palace, hatred brewed. Assassins had always haunted the Macedonian throne, and now they moved again in the shadows. The dagger came from within his own circle, from Pausanias, one of his bodyguards, a man humiliated and embittered, nursing grudges while others whispered in his ear. Whether he acted alone or was guided by Olympias and Alexander remains a mystery. But in Macedonia, nothing happened without hidden hands. The day of reckoning arrived in 336 BC. The city was filled with celebration. Nobles and soldiers gathered for the wedding of Philip's daughter. The king strode through the theatre, robed in majesty, unarmored, basking in the adoration of the crowd. He had silenced every enemy, conquered every rival. Persia lay waiting for his grasp. The crowd rose to cheer him, and then Pausanias struck. From the ranks of his own guard, the assassin lunged forward, blade flashing in the sun. He drove the dagger deep into Philip's chest, the king collapsing in shock as blood poured across his robes. The man who had united Greece, who had forged the army that would conquer the world, lay dying on the ground before his people. In the chaos, Pausanias tried to flee but was cut down by Philip's companions. His reasons died with him, leaving only speculation and the whispers that perhaps Olympias or even Alexander had set the dagger in motion. Philip II of Macedon was gone. His dream of Persia ended not by armies, not by enemies at the border, but by a single thrust from a man standing closest to him. The great architect of conquest was struck down not on the battlefield, but in the theatre of his own people. And yet his legacy did not die. For in the shadows of his fall stood Alexander, the son who would inherit not just a throne, but an empire in waiting. The army Philip had trained, the wealth he had gathered, the vision he had forged, all of it passed to Alexander. The father had built the stage, the son would step upon it and become immortal. But in the end, Philip's fate echoed the eternal lesson of power, that the most dangerous enemies are never across the battlefield. They are always the ones closest to your throne. And as Philip's blood stained the marble of Aegae, a new shadow rose. For in the mountains of Persia, in the fortress of Alamut, a brotherhood would soon emerge whose name became legend. Men who turned assassination into an art, who taught the world that terror could be sharper than any sword. They were called the Hashshashin, and their story is next. High in the Alborz mountains of Persia, where the air grew thin and the paths twisted like a serpent's spine. A fortress clung to the cliffs like the talon of some ancient beast. From a distance it looked like nothing more than jagged stone, another peak among the endless ridges. But those who dared climb closer saw walls rising straight from the mountain, towers that pierced the clouds, and banners fluttering in the cold wind. This was Alamut, the eagle's nest. Here, in the 11th century, a brotherhood was born that would terrify kings, humble empires, and give the world a word that still lingers in every language: assassin. But our story begins not with the fortress, but with a man. Hashshashin Sabba. Born in the city of Qom in Persia, Hassan grew up in a world torn between empires and sects. The Seljuk Turks dominated the land, their armies fierce and their rulers suspicious. Islam itself was divided, Sunni against Shia, caliphs against imams, each claiming the true path. Hassan's family were Shia, believers in the line of Ali. From his earliest days, Hassan was taught that the world was not just a battlefield of armies, but of faith. As a youth, Hassan was brilliant, restless, hungry for knowledge. He devoured books on philosophy, theology, astronomy. His mind was sharp as a blade, but it was his heart that burned hottest. He sought not comfort but purpose. He longed for a truth worth dying for. That search led him to Cairo, the jewel of the Fatimid Caliphate. In Cairo, Hassan's destiny took form. There, in the glittering city of scholars and spies, he was initiated into the Ismaili sect, a branch of Shia Islam that believed in the hidden Imam, the rightful leader of the faithful. The Fatimid caliphs ruled from Cairo, but Hassan's loyalty was not to them. It was to the deeper cause, the hidden truth. He trained not only in theology, but in politics, strategy, and persuasion. He learned that faith was a weapon sharper than any sword, and belief could command men more completely than chains. But Cairo was treacherous. Hassan's ambition and charisma earned him enemies. Plots swirled like desert winds, and whispers marked him as dangerous. Soon he was forced to leave, slipping away from the Nile's brilliance back to Persia, but he did not return empty-handed. He carried with him a mission: to spread the Ismaili faith, to carve out a sanctuary where his people could resist their enemies, and to build an order that would strike fear into the hearts of all who opposed them. For years he wandered, moving from city to city, gathering followers in secret. He spoke with a fire that drew men to him, convincing them that the imams were betrayed, that the Seljuk Turks were usurpers, and that only through discipline and sacrifice could the true faith survive. His charisma was so potent that even hardened warriors abandoned their lords to follow him. But Hassan knew that faith alone would not keep them safe. They needed a fortress, and so his eyes turned to Alamut. Perched high in the mountains, Alamut was a fortress thought impregnable. Its walls rose from sheer cliffs. Its position dominated the valleys below. Whoever controlled it could watch the world like an eagle surveying prey. But it was not his, not yet. Hassan could not storm it with armies, for the Seljuks would crush him, so he chose a different path. Deception disguised, Hassan infiltrated the valley. Slowly, carefully, he converted the villagers to his cause. His followers worked inside the fortress itself, sowing loyalty in whispers and prayers. When the time came, there was no battle, no siege. The fortress simply fell into his hands, its garrison turned by faith and gold. By 1090, Hashshashin Sabba stood upon its walls, looking out across Persia, master of the eagle's nest. From Alamut, the legend of the Hashshashin spread. Hassan ruled not with gold or luxury, but with iron discipline. He lived simply, ate little, prayed often. His followers called him the old man of the mountain, though he was still in his prime. He demanded loyalty, obedience, and sacrifice. Those who faltered were punished without hesitation, but those who obeyed became part of something greater, a brotherhood that would terrify empires. Their weapon was not armies. They could never match the Seljuks in numbers, nor the crusaders in steel. Their weapon was fear. Their strategy was assassination. When Hassan marked an enemy for death, there was no army at the gates, no catapult hurling stones. Instead, a single man would slip into the city, disguised as a beggar, a merchant, a servant. He would move among the crowds, unnoticed, and then, at the appointed moment, he would strike. A dagger in a crowded square, a blade in the darkness of a palace. An enemy of Alamut would fall, not in war, but in the heart of his own stronghold. The message was clear. No one was safe. not kings, not viziers, not generals. The most famous of their early killings was Nizam al-Mulk, the powerful vizier of the Seljuk Empire. He was a man feared across the East, the architect of Seljuk power, but to Hassan, he was an enemy of the faith. One evening in 1092, as Nizam travelled in his litter, a figure approached disguised as a dervish, humble and unthreatening. In an instant, the dagger flashed and the vizier's lifeblood spilled into the earth. The Seljuks reeled. Their greatest minister was dead, slain not by armies but by a single hand guided by Alamut. The death of Nizam al-Mulk sent ripples through the world. A single dagger had done what armies could not. It had unseated the greatest mind of the Seljuk Empire. Fear spread like a plague. Ministers whispered in their courts, looking over their shoulders. Generals kept guards even in their private chambers. For the Hashshashin, fear was the true weapon. The dagger was only its instrument. The legend grew quickly. Hassan's men were not common killers. They were called fidars, devotees, those who sacrificed themselves. To the outside world, it seemed they cared nothing for life, rushing to their deaths with smiles on their faces. Their loyalty to Alamut and their faith in Hassan was absolute. If ordered, they would wait for days, months, even years to strike. They would die without hesitation, certain that paradise awaited them. Whispers spread that Hassan had a secret, a hidden garden within Alamut, filled with rivers of milk and honey, maidens of beauty and intoxicating delights. It was said that young recruits were drugged with hashish, brought into this garden, and made to believe they had tasted paradise. When they awoke, Hassan told them, "Obey, kill in my name, and paradise will be yours forever." Was it true? Perhaps, perhaps not. Much of it may have been myth, spread by terrified enemies, but the name stuck. In Europe, they became known as the Assassins, a word born from those whispers. Their reputation soon crossed beyond Persia into the Holy Land, where crusaders had carved out fragile kingdoms. To these Christian lords, already beset by Saracens and desert heat, the assassins were something far darker. They were shadows in the night, blades in the crowd. One by one, crusader leaders fell. Raymond II of Tripoli was struck down as he rode. Conrad of Montferrat, newly crowned king of Jerusalem, was murdered in the streets, stabbed by assassins who vanished into the chaos. The crusaders trembled. They had faced armies, sieges, and starvation, but nothing unnerved them like this. The knowledge that death could come in a crowded marketplace, at a feast, or even while praying at the altar. Even Saladin, the great Sultan of Egypt and Syria, the warrior who would one day take Jerusalem itself, was not beyond their reach. Twice the assassins came for him. Once, in the chaos of battle, they slipped into his camp, daggers poised. Saladin barely escaped with his life, wounded but alive. Another time, as he lay in his tent, assassins burst upon him. Only his guards' quick action saved him. From that day on, Saladin slept surrounded by a circle of armed men, their swords drawn even in the silence of the night. But the true genius of Hassan's order was not just in the killings, it was in the fear that lingered after. A king might sit upon his throne surrounded by guards, yet still feel unsafe. A vizier might drink from golden cups, yet taste poison in every sip. A general might lead thousands, yet lie awake at night, wondering if the servant who brought him water also carried a blade. This was the power of the assassins. They did not need to kill many. A few deaths, chosen carefully, shattered the courage of entire nations. Their strikes were bold, often public. A dagger thrust in daylight in the middle of a crowd. They wanted witnesses. They wanted screams. They wanted terror to spread. The killer almost never escaped. He did not intend to. His purpose was not survival, but spectacle. Each death was a message. No one is beyond our reach. Stories multiplied. In Aleppo, in Damascus, in Jerusalem, rulers woke to find daggers on their pillows, placed silently while they slept. No blood was spilled, not yet. The message was clear: obey, or next time the blade will not be left behind. Some rulers bent to their will, others sent tribute. Many lived in dread until their final day. And yet, inside Alamut, life was very different. Hassan ruled with iron discipline. There was no decadence, no gardens of luxury for himself. He lived in a small chamber, studied, prayed, and demanded the same austerity from his followers. While enemies imagined orgies of drugs and illusions inside the fortress, the fighters fasted, trained, and prepared for missions. The myth of paradise may have been their enemy's invention, but it worked. feeding the terror that spread across continents. Even the Mongols, whose horsemen trampled kingdoms beneath their hooves, whispered of the assassins. A man might face an army with courage, but who could face an enemy who could be anyone, anywhere, at any time? The power of the assassins was not in their numbers. They never commanded more than a few thousand. Their fortresses were few, their resources limited. But their reach was infinite because their true weapon was belief. They believed in Hassan, in the Imam, in their cause, and belief makes men unstoppable. As the Crusaders fought Saladin, as the Seljuks quarreled among themselves, one name whispered in markets, in palaces, in tents alike: the assassins. And every whisper carried a shiver. The fortress of Alamut was a world apart. To the villagers in the valleys below, it seemed a place touched by otherworldly powers. Its towers vanished into mist. Its walls clung to sheer rock as though the mountain itself had grown claws. When the feeders descended from its gates, they walked like shadows, and when they returned, they often returned no more. To live in Alamut was to live at the edge of the known world, where faith was sharper than steel and discipline ruled every heartbeat. Life inside the fortress was nothing like the rumors whispered in the courts of Europe. Enemies imagined silken gardens filled with maidens, rivers of wine, and fields of narcotic dreams. They spoke of young men intoxicated by hashish, shown visions of paradise, then unleashed upon their enemies as zealots eager to reclaim their heavenly reward. But inside Alamut, reality was harsher, colder, and far more effective. Hassani Saba ruled like a monk and a tyrant combined. He ate little more than bread and water, his chambers bare of luxury. His followers were expected to mirror his austerity. There were no silks, no treasures, no indulgences. Instead, there was prayer, fasting, training, and the study of texts. The Fidars memorized not just scripture, but codes of silence, codes of patience, codes of death. They learned how to move unseen, how to blend into crowds, how to strike with precision. Every corner of Alamut bore Hassan's presence. He punished disobedience with death, even among his closest allies. Once, when 2 of his own sons were accused of betrayal, he ordered their execution. No one is above the law, he declared, and his men obeyed. His will was absolute, his authority unquestioned. To live under Hassan was to surrender not only your life, but your thoughts, your very self. And yet, men flocked to him, eager to be remade in his vision. The myth of the Paradise Garden may have been exaggerated, but Hassan understood the power of illusion. He allowed the stories to spread because they terrified his enemies. If they believed that his assassins were intoxicated fanatics who welcomed death as a doorway to bliss, then every attempt at resistance seemed futile. Who could fight men who wanted nothing more than to die in the act of killing you? And so the myth grew. Tales traveled with merchants and crusaders, of young men drugged into trances, carried into hidden gardens, awakened to a world of beauty, and told that they had tasted heaven. When they awoke again in the fortress, Hassan would whisper, "Obey me, and paradise will be yours forever." True or not, it mattered little. Perception was the strongest weapon of the assassins. The feeders themselves became legends. They did not kill for gold, nor for pleasure, but for duty. Each was given a target, a plan, and the blessing of Hassan. They swore an oath, knowing that death was certain. Many never returned, their bodies left in the streets where their daggers struck, but their sacrifice echoed louder than the clash of armies. One of the most haunting rituals in Alamut was the preparation of a mission. A feeder would spend nights in prayer, his body purified, his mind sharpened. He would sit before Hassan himself, who would place his hand upon his shoulder and speak words known only to them. Then he would descend from the fortress, leaving behind the eagle's nest, knowing he would likely never see it again. Stories spread of their uncanny patience. An assassin might serve for years in disguise, working as a servant, a soldier, even a priest, waiting for the moment to strike. Some shared meals with their targets, smiled at them, bowed before them, only to plunge a dagger into their chest when the order came. That was the true terror. The killer was never a faceless enemy at the gates. He was the man standing beside you. One tale tells of a Fidar who infiltrated the court of a crusader baron. For years he served faithfully, gaining trust, rising in favor. The baron came to depend on him, confided in him, even considered him a friend. And then one day, during a feast, as the baron raised his goblet to drink, the Fidar drew his dagger and cut him down before all his guests. He did not flee. He did not beg. He simply waited, smiling as guards butchered him. His purpose was complete. This willingness to die was the assassin's deadliest weapon. A soldier might fight bravely, but he always hoped to live. A feeder fought, knowing he would die, and that made him unstoppable. The fortress itself reflected this philosophy. There was no comfort in Alamut, no indulgence. Its chambers were stark, its walls cold. Its strength lay not in stone, but in the faith of its people. Farmers in the valleys below provided food. Traders brought supplies, but the heart of Alamut was discipline. It was less a fortress than a crucible, a place where men were forged into weapons. And yet, for all its severity, Alamut commanded awe. Visitors spoke of its libraries, filled with books on science, mathematics, and philosophy. Hassan, for all his zeal, was a man of intellect. Knowledge was as sacred to him as faith. In the shadows of the fortress, wisdom and death lived side by side. To outsiders, it was a nest of demons. To those within, it was paradise. Not of gardens and maidens, but of certainty. Every man knew his place, his purpose, his fate. In a world of chaos, that certainty was its own kind of heaven. But outside its walls, the legend grew darker. Kings whispered of daggers left on their pillows, a silent warning from the old man of the mountain. Generals awoke to find their guards slain silently in the night. Merchants told tales of fidars vanishing into crowds, only to strike again in another city. Some rulers, too terrified to oppose them, paid tribute instead. The assassins collected not just blood, but gold. Fear had become their empire. Even the mighty Saladin, though he escaped death, treated them with caution. He knew that an army could be defeated in battle, but an assassin needed only one chance, one heartbeat, one blade. And as long as Alamut stood, no man in the Middle East could truly sleep in peace. The assassins had built more than a fortress in Alamut. They had built an empire of whispers. They never ruled vast lands, nor commanded vast armies, but their influence stretched further than any king's. It reached into palaces, markets, courts, and battlefields carried not by banners but by fear. By the late 12th century, their name was enough to unnerve the bravest. When a ruler opposed them, he might awake one morning to find a dagger pinned to his pillow. No harm done, yet, but the meaning was unmistakable. A choice was offered: bend to the will of Alamut, or face death. Many chose to obey. Some paid tribute in gold, others promised neutrality. A few ignored the warning, and never lived to regret it. One of the most famous killings that cemented their legend was the assassination of Conrad of Montferrat, newly crowned King of Jerusalem. The year was 1192. The Crusader states were already fragile, their lands pressed by Saladin's armies and their kings divided by intrigue. Conrad had just been chosen to rule when two men approached him in the streets of Tyre. They were dressed as humble monks, their faces lowered in reverence. Conrad, perhaps weary but unsuspecting, allowed them close. In a sudden flash, daggers gleamed. The king staggered, struck down before the eyes of his subjects. The killers did not flee. They had no need. They were seized, tortured, but they confessed proudly they were sent by the assassins of Alamut. Conrad's reign ended before it began, and the whole Crusader world trembled. The Hashshashin had struck in the heart of Christendom's last bastion, and their message was heard as far as Rome and Paris. No wall, no crown, no army could protect a man from the old man of the mountain, but not even Saladin, the great sultan, was safe. Though he escaped their blades twice, his men never forgot the terror of those nights. Guards would whisper that daggers glinted in the shadows, that footsteps echoed where none should be. Some claimed to see hooded figures vanish into the desert, leaving only fear behind. Even Saladin himself, though a master of war, treated them with caution. He negotiated with them, wary of provoking their wrath further. To fight an army, you could gather men and steel. To fight the assassins, you could gather nothing, for they were everywhere and nowhere. What made the Hashshashin truly powerful was not only their killings, but their politics. They knew when to strike and when to stay their hand. They assassinated some Crusader lords but spared others, striking bargains when it suited them. They played a careful game, surviving between stronger powers by making themselves too dangerous to attack. The Seljuks, the Crusaders, even Saladin, all had reason to fear them, but also to deal with them. It was a balance of terror, and for more than a century it worked. Yet every empire of shadows meets its end. For the Hashshashin, It came not from the Seljuks or the crusaders, but from the storm that swept across Asia in the 13th century, the Mongols. The Mongols were unlike any enemy before them. Where others feared the assassins, the Mongols feared nothing. They had burned cities to ash, slaughtered millions, and erased kingdoms in days. When they came to Persia, Alamut's legend was put to the test. At first, the assassins tried their old weapon. Daggers were sent against Mongol leaders, but the Mongols were not shaken. Where kings trembled at a blade, the Mongols responded with fire and steel. They did not flinch, they did not compromise, they did not bow to fear. In 1256, Hulagu Khan, brother of the great Khan Munka, marched on Alamut. His army was vast, his siege engines powerful. The fortress that had defied so many now faced an enemy who could grind mountains to dust. For weeks, the Mongols hammered its walls, their catapults raining destruction. The assassins fought bravely, but they were no match for the tide of horsemen and fire. Finally, Alamut fell. Its libraries were burned, its towers toppled, its people slaughtered. The eagle's nest was shattered, its talons broken. The old man of the mountain was long dead, but his order crumbled in the fire. And yet, the legend did not die. Even as the Mongols erased Alamut, the name of the assassins lived on. In Europe, stories grew wilder. Marco Polo would later write of gardens of paradise and intoxicating potions, of fanatics who killed without fear. Whether truth or myth, the tales spread. And from those tales came a word that passed into every tongue: assassin. The Hashshashin were gone, their fortresses dust, but their shadow remains. They showed the world that fear could be sharper than any sword, that belief could be stronger than any wall, and that a dagger in the right place could change the course of history. And so, as the fires of Alamut died, another story from the ancient world was already waiting to be told. For centuries before the Hashshashin, in the narrow streets of Jerusalem, another brotherhood of killers once walked. They carried daggers hidden beneath their robes, striking in marketplaces and temples, vanishing into the crowd. They were called the Sicarii, the dagger-men, and their story is next. They were called the Sicarii, the dagger-men. To the Romans, they were fanatics, terrorists cloaked in righteousness. To their followers, they were freedom fighters, martyrs who wielded death in the name of God and liberty. They carried no armies, commanded no fleets, yet they terrified the mightiest empire of their age with nothing more than short curved blades hidden beneath their robes. The story begins in the shadow of Rome's conquest of Judea. When Pompey marched his legions into Jerusalem in 63 BC, the sacred temple itself was defiled by foreign soldiers. Rome installed puppet kings, exacted taxes, and drowned rebellion in blood. To many Jews, the world had collapsed, the chosen people enslaved by pagans, their holy city ruled by outsiders. Outrage simmered in every alley, every marketplace. And from that outrage, the Sicarii were born. They were a splinter of the Zealots, a sect that believed compromise with Rome was betrayal against God. But while the Zealots railed in speeches and open revolt, the Sicarii struck in silence. Their weapon was the Sika, a short, curved dagger easily concealed beneath cloaks. In crowded festivals, they mingled with the people. At the height of prayer or sacrifice, their blades would flash. Collaborators, Roman sympathizers, priests accused of corruption, all fell in sudden, shocking executions. Before anyone realized what had happened, the assassins melted back into the crowd, vanishing like ghosts. Fear spread faster than fire. No man who served Rome could feel safe, not even in the heart of Jerusalem. To accept Roman rule was to carry a target on your back. The Sicarii turned the very heart of society into a battlefield, where death could come from the man standing next to you in prayer. The Romans despised them, branding them as criminals. Yet to the oppressed, their audacity was intoxicating. They were proof that even the greatest empire could bleed, that a handful of men with blades could strike terror into legions. Mothers whispered their names to children like a prayer and a warning. And in the corridors of power, governors and priests alike trembled. Their leader, a man named Menahem, burned with fire for rebellion. He dreamed not merely of killing collaborators, but of casting Rome itself from Judea. When revolt erupted in 66 AD, the Sicarii were among its fiercest blades. They stormed fortresses, seized weapons, and even took hold of Jerusalem itself. For a time they stood triumphant, their daggers turned outward against Rome's soldiers. But Rome was not a foe easily broken. Vespasian and his legions marched into Judea with ruthless discipline, crushing cities, slaughtering rebels, and driving survivors into the desert, the Sicarii, hunted and hated, withdrew into strongholds like Masada, a fortress perched on a desert plateau, seemingly untouchable. From there, they continued their war, raiding villages, killing not just Romans, but fellow Jews who sought compromise. To the Sicarii, there was no neutrality. You were either for God's freedom, or you were marked for death. Even their own people began to fear them, seeing in their fanaticism a cruelty as sharp as their daggers. Yet the Sicarii did not flinch. To die by the blade was glory. To live under Rome was dishonor. And so they fought on, their numbers dwindling, their cause burning ever brighter, even as it consumed them. The revolt spread like wildfire through Judea, and the Sicarii sharpened their blades with every ember. To them, the rebellion was not merely politics or resistance. It was divine destiny. They stalked Jerusalem's crowded streets, hunting collaborators with the same zeal they turned against Roman soldiers. Any man who counseled peace with Rome was branded a traitor. Priests, officials, even fellow Jews were struck down in alleys and marketplaces, their blood staining the stones of the holy city. The terror they sowed was deliberate. They wanted Rome's power to feel fragile, and they wanted their own people to know that neutrality was no refuge. In the city of God, one could not stand between rebellion and submission. One either resisted with a blade or risked falling beneath one. The Sicarii thrived on this fear, for fear was their shield against the legions that outnumbered and outarmed them 100 to 1. In 66 AD, their leader Menahem achieved his greatest triumph. The fortress of Masada, perched high above the Judean desert, fell into their hands. Roman garrisons were slaughtered, and the Sicarii claimed their own stronghold. With Masada as their sanctuary, they believed themselves untouchable. They marched back to Jerusalem in splendor, their daggers flashing, their ranks swollen with followers intoxicated by their defiance. For a moment, it seemed as if their dream might become reality. Roman authority wavered. Governors fled, garrisons burned. Jerusalem belonged to the rebels, and the Sicarii were hailed as champions. In the temple itself, Menahem strode like a king, robed in splendor, daring to act as the savior of Judea. But ambition is as deadly as any Roman spear. Other factions of rebels resented the Sicarii's arrogance and feared Menahem's growing power. When the festival crowds thronged Jerusalem, rival zealots ambushed him. The man who had dared to crown himself a Messiah was cut down in the holy city he had sworn to free. His body was left broken, and the Sicarii were forced back to Masada, their sanctuary becoming both fortress and prison. Rome, meanwhile, was stirring to full wrath. Vespasian marched with legions that moved like iron machines. Cities that resisted were leveled. Thousands were slaughtered or enslaved. In Jerusalem, factions of rebels turned on one another, fighting each other even as the Roman noose tightened around the city. The Sicarii, true to their nature, shed Jewish blood as readily as Roman, slaughtering those who tried to negotiate, burning granaries to force resistance, even killing families who sought surrender. To them, compromise was sin, and survival without freedom was worse than death. Their fanaticism isolated them. Many Jews cursed them as much as they cursed the Romans. Yet even hated, they inspired a dark kind of awe. No army could erase them entirely. In marketplaces and back alleys, assassinations continued. A Roman officer might kneel to pray and never rise again. A priest might walk home in peace and collapse with a dagger in his ribs. The Sicarii proved that Rome's might could not kill shadows. But shadows cannot stop legions forever. The Romans tightened their grip on Judea, preparing to crush Jerusalem itself. And as the great city braced for its final siege, the Sicarii prepared not for peace or survival, but for a last, desperate embrace of death. Jerusalem was drowning in chaos. As Roman legions tightened their siege, the holy city turned into a cage of hunger, fire, and betrayal. Yet even as starvation gnawed at its people, the Sicarii sharpened their daggers. To them, surrender was worse than death, and compromise with Rome was treason against God himself. Inside the city walls, factions warred not only with the Romans outside, but with each other. Zealots, priests, moderates, all turned on one another in desperation. In this madness, the Sicarii proved the most ruthless of all. They stormed granaries, setting fire to stores of grain that might have fed the city for months. Their reasoning was as chilling as their blades. They believed starvation would harden the people's resolve, forcing them to fight to the last breath rather than seek mercy from Rome. But for the starving mothers, the crying children, the old men collapsing in the streets, the Sicarii were no heroes. They were tormentors. Families who whispered of surrender vanished in the night. Priests who begged for peace were struck down in the temple itself. The assassins moved through Jerusalem like a fever, punishing hesitation with death. The Romans could encircle the city, but the Sicarii made sure despair grew from within. When the legions finally breached Jerusalem in 70 AD, the destruction was beyond imagination. The temple, the holiest place in the Jewish world, went up in flames, its gold melting into the cracks of the stones. Tens of thousands were slaughtered, their bodies choking the streets. Survivors were dragged in chains, sold into slavery, scattered across the empire. The Jewish revolt had ended in ashes, and Rome stood triumphant. But the Sicarii did not die with Jerusalem. They retreated once more to their stronghold, Masada. High on its desert plateau, with sheer cliffs rising like walls to the sky, it seemed unassailable. Here, the dagger-men and their families took refuge, hundreds of them, clinging to the dream of resistance, even as the rest of Judea lay in ruins. From Masada, they raided villages, striking down Romans and Jews alike, leaving terror in their wake. They were cut off, hated, hunted, yet still they defied the empire. Rome could not leave them be. In 73 AD, the legions marched to Masada, determined to snuff out the last flame of rebellion. Thousands of soldiers surrounded the plateau. Siege engines creaked, and slowly, relentlessly, the Romans began to build. Day after day they dragged stone and timber, raising an immense ramp up the side of the cliffs, a mountain of their own making, crawling toward the fortress that had mocked them for years. From the heights, the Sicarii watched their doom being constructed, plank by plank, stone by stone. They knew the Romans would not stop. The empire had all the time in the world, and Masada would not stand forever. But if death was coming, the Sicarii resolved that it would not be Rome's victory. The desert wind howled across the plateau of Masada, as if it carried the voices of the dead. Below, the Roman legions toiled day and night, their torches flickering like 1,000 stars against the black sky. The ramp rose higher with every sunrise, an unstoppable mountain of stone creeping toward the fortress walls. The Sicarii watched from above, their knives at their sides, their children clinging to them, their wives praying beneath the desert moon. They knew the end was coming. For weeks the tension grew. Food dwindled. Water ran scarce. The air inside the fortress grew heavy with the certainty of doom. Some whispered of surrender, of throwing themselves on Roman mercy. But mercy was not Rome's gift. They had seen Jerusalem burn, had watched their kin crucified by the thousands. They knew that if captured, they would be paraded in chains, their wives and daughters sold as slaves, their sons slaughtered or dragged into the arenas of Rome to die for sport. For the Sicarii, this was a fate far worse than death. So their leader, Eleazar ben Yair, gathered them one final time. In the torchlight, his voice echoed across the stone chambers. He reminded them that freedom was not measured in victories, but in the refusal to bow. Better to die free, he declared, than live as slaves. His words were fire, and the people wept, not with despair, but with a terrible resolve. That night, they made their choice. The men embraced their wives and children one last time. With heavy hearts, they killed them, not out of cruelty, but to spare them the horrors of Roman capture. Tears mixed with blood as families ended by the hands of those who loved them most. Then the men drew lots, choosing who among them would kill the others, and who would be the last to fall upon his own blade. The silence of that night was deafening. No clash of armies, no cries of rebellion, only the grim ritual of death carried out with devotion. When the last man fell, Masada was a graveyard. 900 bodies lay within its walls, their daggers stilled, their cores extinguished in fire and blood. At dawn, the Romans pushed their siege engines to the summit. They burst through the gates, weapons raised, expecting screams, resistance, a final desperate fight. Instead, they found only silence. Smoke curled into the sky. Bodies lay in rows. The fortress was theirs, but their victory was hollow. The Sicarii had denied them the triumph of conquest. Rome could claim the land, but the last word belonged to the dagger-men who chose death over chains. Masada became legend. To some, it was fanaticism at its darkest, the madness of men who brought ruin even upon their own people. To others, it was martyrdom, the ultimate refusal to submit to tyranny. The truth lies somewhere in the shadow between, but one fact cannot be denied. the Sicarii carved their name into history, not with armies, but with fear, with daggers, and with the final act of defiance that shook even the Empire of Rome. And as the desert winds swept over the ruins of Masada, it carried the whisper of their legacy, that no empire, however mighty, can ever fully conquer the human will to resist, even if resistance ends in death. And as the desert winds swept across the empty fortress of Masada, another empire far to the east was already shaping its own bloody tales of intrigue. In the palaces of Persia, kings rose and fell not by armies or daggers in markets, but by poison in goblets and betrayal in their very courts. The Sicarii had shown the world the terror of the dagger. The Persians would show the terror of the cup. The palaces of Persia glittered like jewels in the desert. At Persepolis, golden columns rose like forests of fire, carved reliefs of kings and subjects stretching across endless stone. Courtiers in robes of silk whispered in marble halls, while musicians played under painted ceilings. To the outside world, the kings of Persia seemed like gods upon the earth, but behind the silks, behind the incense and wine, their throne was soaked in blood. The Achaemenid Empire was the greatest the world had yet seen, stretching from the Indus to the Nile, from the mountains of Anatolia to the deserts of Arabia. Its kings ruled millions. Their words carried on roads that spanned continents, their armies vast and their wealth limitless. But all that power sat upon a knife's edge, for in Persia, kingship was never safe. Every brother was a rival, every son a threat, every servant a potential executioner. The struggle was constant. When Xerxes II, son of Artaxerxes V, inherited the throne in 424 BC, he had scarcely begun to rule before he was murdered. His killer was not an enemy general, not a foreign invader, but his own brother, Sogdianus. With a dagger and a plot whispered in the palace, the young king's reign ended before it began. But Sogdianus's triumph was short-lived. Within a year, he too was struck down, poisoned by another brother, Darius II, who seized the throne in turn. Betrayal followed betrayal, blood followed blood, until the very concept of loyalty seemed laughable. In Persia, daggers were not drawn only on battlefields. They gleamed in banquet halls, slipped between ribs under the glow of torches, or were dipped in cups of wine passed by smiling hands. Poison was an art, a weapon as common as the sword. A courtier might dine with you, toast to your health, and within the hour you would gasp for breath, your insides burning. Servants, eunuchs, even queens were masters of these quiet murders. The harem, that hidden world of women within the palace, was no less deadly. Queens and concubines plotted for their sons, whispering into the ears of kings, arranging marriages and murders alike. The royal bedchamber was as dangerous as any battlefield. Those who survived longest were not always the bravest, but the most cunning. They learned to test every goblet, to watch every servant's eyes, to suspect every friend. Kings ruled over millions, yet they could not trust the man who poured their wine. The Persian court was a theatre of death. Every nod of the king might mean life. Every glance of a rival might mean doom. Daggers and poisons were not only tools of murder, they were the language of power. And as we move deeper into their world, we see not just kings who fell, but queens who killed, sons who betrayed, and guards who decided the fate of empires. Persia, for all its glory, was an empire of fear. In the great halls of Susa, where jeweled thrones glittered and incense curled through painted columns, a new king rose, Artaxerxes II. He was son of Darius II, heir to an empire of wealth and suspicion. But no sooner had he settled upon the throne than daggers stirred in the shadows. His greatest rival was not a foreign invader, but his own brother, Cyrus the Younger. Cyrus had been raised with ambition burning in his veins. His mother, Queen Parysatis, adored him, favored him above all her other sons. To her, Cyrus was destined to rule, not Artaxerxes, and she whispered this into his ears, feeding him dreams of kingship. When Darius II died in 404 BC, Cyrus gathered his forces and marched against his brother. The empire trembled as brother faced brother. On one side, Artaxerxes, cloaked in royal legitimacy, with the Persian court and much of the army. On the other, Cyrus, younger, fiery, but supported by none other than the Greek mercenaries, hardened veterans of Sparta and Athens who sold their swords to the highest bidder. Among them was Xenophon, who would later write the famous Anabasis, the March of the 10,000. The two armies met at Cunaxa on the plains of Mesopotamia. Dust filled the air, bronze shields glinted in the sun, and cries of war shook the earth. Cyrus fought with reckless courage, cutting his way through ranks of spearmen. At one point, he came so close to Artaxerxes that he hurled a spear, striking his brother's chest. But the blow did not kill. The king was wounded, but alive. And then, in a heartbeat, Cyrus fell. A Persian spear pierced him in the chaos, and he collapsed, blood soaking the dust. The rebellion ended in an instant. The Greek mercenaries, trapped deep in Persia without their patron, began their long and desperate retreat north, the famous March of the 10,000. Artaxerxes was secure on his throne, but security in Persia was always an illusion. Though Cyrus was dead, the poison of betrayal lingered. Queen Parysatis, furious at the death of her beloved son, turned her wrath upon the court. She blamed those who had stood against Cyrus, and one by one they fell. Some were accused of treason and executed. Others were poisoned in silence, their deaths disguised as illness. At banquets, Parysatis would smile sweetly, serve wine to her guests, and watch as they writhed in agony hours later. Even Artaxerxes himself could not escape her shadow. Though he ruled, his mother's influence was overwhelming. She manipulated, whispered, and punished without fear. No servant dared refuse her. No noble dared cross her. In Persia, queens were often unseen, veiled behind the walls of the harem. But Parysatis was different. She was the spider at the center of the web, weaving threads of intrigue that ensnared even kings. Yet for all her cunning, even she could not control the empire forever. Artaxerxes ruled for decades, but his reign was plagued by rebellions and betrayals. Satraps in distant provinces defied him. Egypt broke free. The Greeks raided the coasts. Inside the court, every whisper carried suspicion. The eunuchs, who guarded the palaces and chambers, grew powerful. They alone had constant access to the king, carrying his secrets, guarding his life, or ending it. Some were loyal, others bought by gold or seduced by promises. In the shadows of the harem, they delivered letters, arranged meetings, carried daggers. Many kings trusted them, but trust in Persia was often a fatal mistake. The throne of Persia was a glittering prison. Kings ruled the largest empire on earth, yet lived in constant fear. They dined in splendor, but every goblet might carry poison. They reclined on golden couches, but every servant might carry a blade. They ruled millions, but they could not trust their own families. Artaxerxes survived longer than most, but his reign showed the pattern that defined Persian kingship. Brother against brother, mother against son, servant against master, and each conflict was resolved not by armies on the battlefield, but by daggers in the dark and poison in the cup. The empire endured, its wealth and armies vast. But inside its glittering palaces, the rot grew deeper, trust decayed, suspicion ruled, and the culture of betrayal spread like a plague. The court of Persia sparkled on the surface, banquets with golden cups, dancers moving to the sound of lyres, tables heavy with figs, honey, roasted meats, and sweet wine. But beneath the glitter, the palace was a slaughterhouse dressed in silk. Every feast could become a funeral, every toast a death sentence. At the center of this deadly theater was Queen Parysatis. She was no ordinary consort, no passive figure in the harem's shadows. She was fierce, calculating, and utterly ruthless. Her love for her son Cyrus the Younger had shaped her heart into iron, and when he fell at Cunaxa, her grief turned into vengeance. She began her campaign quietly. The generals and courtiers who had stood against Cyrus were invited to dine with her. They came, reassured by her smile, soothed by her hospitality. She poured their wine with her own hands, tore bread for them, shared sweet fruits from her plate. And then, hours later, they writhed in agony, their faces twisting, their cries echoing through the palace halls. Some died foaming at the mouth, others choking as their lungs burned. Parysatis had mastered the art of poison. She kept a secret chest of powders and potions, each deadly in its own way. Some killed instantly, others slowly. Some left no trace. Others ensured the victim's body was blackened and bloated as a warning. Servants whispered of a special preparation she kept hidden, a slow-working venom that could be slipped into a single piece of meat, so subtle that one half of the dish could be eaten safely while the other brought death. This was her favorite method, for it allowed her to share the table with her victim. to smile and eat from the same platter, while only the unlucky portion carried the fatal bite. She delighted in watching their eyes widen with fear as the poison took hold, knowing that she, untouched, would finish her meal in peace. Even her own family was not spared. At one point, suspicion fell upon one of her daughters-in-law, Stateira, wife of Artaxerxes II. Parysatis despised her, seeing her as an obstacle to her influence over the king. At a banquet, she prepared a dish of rare delicacies, dividing it carefully. One portion safe, the other poisoned. She offered it to Stateira with a smile. Hours later, the young queen convulsed and died. Parysatis had removed another rival, and demonstrated once more that in Persia, blood ties offered no protection. Her cruelty became infamous. Nobles trembled at her presence, yet none dared confront her. To accuse her was to invite death. Even Artaxerxes himself tolerated her terrors. For though he was king, she was his mother. He could not bring himself to defy her fully, and so the poisonings continued, a silent reign of terror within the golden halls. But Parysatis was not alone in weaving death. The court was thick with rivals who learned from her example. Eunuchs, who tended the royal chambers, became masters of secrets. They controlled who could approach the king, what whispers reached his ears, what food touched his lips. A single eunuch could raise a man to power or destroy him with a word. Some became kingmakers, others executioners. More than once, a ruler placed his trust in a eunuch, only to discover too late that the servant's loyalty had been bought by gold or ambition. The paranoia was endless. Food tasters sampled every dish before the king dared touch it. Cups were passed between trusted hands, tested with silver spoons in hopes of detecting poison. Yet still deaths came. No protection was perfect, no precaution enough. The court of Persia became a labyrinth of suspicion, where every glance was a question, and every smile might hide a dagger. In this world, power did not rest on armies alone. It rested on fear, cunning, and the ability to strike before being struck. Kings might lead legions into battle, but within their own walls, they lived as prisoners of their own fear. The legacy of Parysatis endured. She had shown that queens could kill as surely as kings, that poison could rule as effectively as the sword. Her name was cursed by some, admired by others, remembered by all who knew that in Persia, the most dangerous throne in the world was the one draped in gold. By the time her shadow faded, the empire itself was already weakening. Satraps in distant provinces grew bolder, rebellions smoldered, and enemies at the borders sensed opportunity. The throne of Persia still glittered, but its foundations were cracking, and as the line of kings continued, so too did the daggers and poisons, weaving death into the very fabric of rule. The decades after Parysatis were no less bloody. Her son, Artaxerxes II, managed to cling to the throne longer than most Persian kings, ruling for more than 40 years. But his reign, too, was choked with suspicion. Rebellions rose in Egypt, satraps in Asia Minor defied his authority, and every banquet in Persepolis was still haunted by the fear of poison. Artaxerxes lived old by Persian standards, but age did not save him from the dagger of doubt. Toward the end of his life, he drowned in paranoia, eliminating rivals both real and imagined. Some say that he executed his own son, Darius, when rumors spread of a plot against him. Others whisper that the court itself had grown tired of his rule, and that the eunuchs encouraged the suspicions until he cut down his own heirs, leaving chaos in his wake. When Artaxerxes II finally died, the throne passed to his son, Artaxerxes III. But even this succession was tainted with blood. The new king, desperate to secure power, slaughtered most of his brothers to prevent rebellion. It was a grim lesson. In Persia, the first act of a king was often murder. Artaxerxes III proved strong at first. He restored some order, crushed rebellions, and marched armies into Egypt to reclaim lost lands. Yet for all his strength, even he was not safe in the golden halls of his own palace. In 338 BC, he too fell, poisoned by one of his closest advisors, the eunuch Bagoas. Bagoas was the very embodiment of Persia's disease. Trusted, soft-spoken, always near the throne, he used his position not to serve but to rule from the shadows. After murdering Artaxerxes III, he placed the crown on the head of young Arses, the king's son. But Arses was only a puppet. When he tried to defy his master, Bagoas poisoned him as well. For a time, it seemed as though the eunuch had become the true king of Persia. He decided who lived, who died, who wore the crown. But ambition carries its own doom. In 336 BC, Bagoas raised Darius III to the throne. Darius, more cautious than his predecessors, quickly realized the danger. Before the poisoner could strike again, Bagoas was forced to drink his own venom. The kingmaker had become his own victim. Darius III, the last of the Achaemenid kings, was left to rule an empire riddled with betrayal. Satraps no longer trusted one another. The military was weakened by decades of intrigue, and the very court itself was a nest of serpents. Darius was no coward, but he inherited a poisoned kingdom, and at that moment, from the west came a storm. Alexander of Macedon, newly crowned and burning with ambition, marched into Persia with his phalanxes and cavalry. At Issus, at Gaugamela, he shattered Persian armies. Darius fled, abandoned by his generals, betrayed even in his final days. When he was at last captured, it was not by Alexander, but by his own satraps, men who, fearing the conqueror's wrath, struck down their king in his flight. The great king of Persia, lord of millions, died not at the hands of an enemy hero, but at the daggers of his supposed allies. The Achaemenid Empire crumbled. Persepolis was burned, its golden halls reduced to ash. The kings who had ruled from thrones of ivory and gold, who had commanded armies and taxed continents, had been undone not by foreign armies alone, but by the poison in their own courts, by the daggers of their own families, by the betrayals of those closest to them. Persia's greatness had been built on order and discipline, but it had rotted from within. The throne had become a death sentence, a gilded seat where no man sat long without blood spilling onto the marble. And in the end, when Alexander walked through the ruins of Persepolis, the echo of Persian kingship was not glory, but whispers of poison and betrayal. As the flames of Persepolis died, the story of Persia's king-killers came to its end. But further east, across the mountains and rivers of India, another empire was rising. There too daggers and poisons shaped the fate of kings. There too shadows walked beside thrones. In the courts of the Mauryas and their rivals, a new breed of assassins would emerge, women whose very touch was lethal, and ministers whose cunning could topple dynasties. The hidden blades of India awaited. The monsoon rains had passed, and the plains of northern India steamed with life. Palaces of stone rose above bustling cities. Elephants lumbered through crowded streets, and Brahmin priests chanted under the shade of banyan trees. This was the land of kings and dynasties, where power shifted not only on the battlefield, but also in the hidden chambers of the court. Here, unlike in Persia or Jerusalem, assassination was not always a sudden dagger in the dark. In India, death often came slowly, slipped into food or drink, carried by courtesans, or delivered by women raised from childhood to kill with nothing more than a touch. The most chilling of these weapons were the Vishakanyas, the poison maidens. According to legend, these girls were fed tiny doses of venom from infancy. Their bodies absorbed it, adapted to it, until their very breath, their very skin, carried death. To lie with them was to embrace mortality, for a kiss could stop a heart, and a touch could wither flesh. They were beautiful, alluring, and lethal. Kings kept them not for pleasure, but as weapons, gifts to unsuspecting rivals. To accept such a gift was to sign one's death warrant, whether the tales were exaggerated or not. They reveal a truth about the politics of India. Assassination was an accepted tool of statecraft. At the dawn of the Mauryan Empire, in the 4th century BC, this art was elevated by one man, Chanakya, known also as Kautilya. He was not a king but a minister, a thinker, a strategist whose mind was sharper than any blade. He wrote the Arthashastra, a treatise on politics and war that did not flinch from ruthlessness. In its pages, he detailed how a ruler should use spies, poisons, and assassins to secure power. To him, morality was nothing compared to survival. The state was all, and any means were justified to protect it. Chanakya's rise began with humiliation. Once insulted by the Nanda kings of Magadha, he vowed to overthrow them. He found his instrument in a young man named Chandragupta, ambitious and fierce. Together, they plotted not only battles but murders. Their enemies did not always fall on the field. They often fell in their palaces, poisoned by food, seduced by courtesans, or betrayed by servants. One story tells of how Chanakya introduced poison into Chandragupta's meals in small doses, training his body to resist it. He feared that enemies would try to kill the young king with venom, and so he turned poison into protection. Yet even this plan carried its tragedies. Once, Chandragupta's pregnant queen ate from his plate. The poison overwhelmed her, and though Chanakya cut open her belly to save the child, only the infant, Bindusara, survived. The queen died in agony, another life claimed by the shadows of power. Bindusara himself would later become king, remembered as Amitragata, the slayer of enemies. And true to his name, his court too was rife with death delivered in silence. Spies crept through markets, listening, poisoning wells, sowing discord. Assassination was not shameful. It was a tool as common as the sword. But it was under Ashoka, grandson of Chandragupta, that India saw both the heights of brutality and the depths of remorse. As a young prince, Ashoka was ruthless. Stories say he murdered his own brothers to secure the throne, their bodies left broken in the palaces of Pataliputra. His early reign was marked by blood, and yet, after the massacre of Kalinga, he transformed, embracing Buddhism and renouncing violence. Still, the shadow of assassination never left India's courts. Long after Ashoka's death, dynasties rose and fell, often not by the clash of armies, but by the betrayal of a single hand. Ministers poisoned rivals, queens plotted against stepsons, generals turned daggers against kings. In India, as in Persia, power was never safe, but here it carried a special intimacy. The whisper of a courtesan, the cup of spiced wine, the embrace of a maiden trained from birth to be a weapon. The dagger was sharp, but poison was sharper still. And as the Mauryan Empire grew, the hidden blades moved with it, shaping history one death at a time. Bindusara, the son of Chandragupta, and the boy who had survived his mother's death by poison, grew up in a world where venom was both weapon and shield. His very name, Amitragata, meant slayer of enemies, and he lived up to it. The Mauryan Empire at this time stretched vast, from the Hindu Kush to the Bay of Bengal, from the Himalayas to the Deccan. Its roads bustled with merchants, its cities hummed with trade, and its armies thundered across the plains. Yet beneath this grandeur lay the invisible web of spies, assassins, and poisoners that kept the empire secure. Chanakya's influence lingered even after Chandragupta's death. The Arthashastra was not just a book of advice, but a manual of survival. It taught rulers that open war was costly, but a cup of poisoned milk was cheap. A dagger slipped between ribs in a crowded market could end a rebellion before it began. A courtesan's embrace could do what armies could not. Bindusara inherited not just his father's empire, but also this ruthless machinery. He is said to have written to the Seleucid kings of the West, requesting figs, wine, and a philosopher who could teach him the art of statecraft. But philosophers were not the only gifts exchanged between courts. In the shadows, spies crossed borders carrying messages, poisons, and secrets. The Mauryan court relied heavily on Vishakanyas, the poison maidens. Legends tell us they were gifted to rebellious nobles or hostile kings. Their beauty was irresistible, their presence a sign of royal favor. But to accept them was to die. A single night in their arms could drain the life from even the strongest man. Some stories describe entire provinces brought under control when a defiant leader mysteriously collapsed after entertaining one of these fatal courtesans. But not all killings were dressed in silks. Sometimes, assassins worked in the grime of the streets. Bindusara's spies mingled with merchants, priests, and soldiers. They poisoned wells, spread rumors, and reported every whisper of dissent. The Arthashastra had laid down detailed instructions. Use children, beggars, even monks as agents. Strike not only at leaders, but at their families. Sow terror until obedience was the only refuge. One tale describes a rebellious satrap who plotted to break away from Mauryan control. Rather than send an army, Bindusara sent gifts, fine food, wine, and attendants. Days later, the satrap was dead, his tongue blackened, his insides corroded by poison. His rebellion ended before it began. In the Mauryan court itself, Bindusara faced danger not only from distant provinces, but from his own family. Princes jostled for power, queens whispered in shadows, and ministers played their own games. To rule in India was to sit at the center of a wheel of daggers. One wrong move, one wrong trust, and the wheel would turn against you. Bindusara's reign, though remembered as stable, was anything but peaceful behind closed doors. He relied on a vast secret service, a network that carried his eyes and ears into every corner of the empire. Priests in temples, merchants on roads, even women in marketplaces served as informants. Few dared to plot openly, for they knew that the king's gaze was everywhere, and yet, even the strongest spy network could not eliminate betrayal entirely. More than once, princes rose against their father, hoping to snatch the throne. Some were banished, some mysteriously vanished. Their stories are shadows in history, hints of blood spilled quietly in palace chambers. When Bindusara finally died, the succession was, as always, soaked in violence. Dozens of princes competed for power. Brothers killed brothers, allies betrayed allies. And from this storm emerged Ashoka, the most ruthless of them all. Ashoka's path to the throne was paved with corpses. Some say he slaughtered 99 of his brothers, leaving only one alive. Whether this number is truth or legend, it speaks to the brutality of the time. In Mauryan India, a prince's greatest enemy was not across the border, but within his own bloodline. And Ashoka, raised in this world of poison and betrayal, embraced it without hesitation. His early reign was a continuation of the same shadow war that had defined his father and grandfather. Assassins, poison, and terror as tools of rule. Yet fate had other plans for him, for the empire he built upon blood would one day shake under the weight of his conscience. Ashoka's name would one day be remembered as the Great, the emperor who spread Buddhism across Asia, the king of compassion. But before the world saw a saint, India knew a butcher. His rise began in shadows, like every Mauryan prince before him. After Bindusara's death, the empire fractured. Dozens of princes claimed legitimacy. Mothers maneuvered for their sons. Ministers schemed for power. The palace halls echoed with whispers and screams. The sound of poisoned cups hitting marble floors. The cries of brothers strangled in their chambers. Ashoka, unlike many of his rivals, did not hesitate. He moved with ruthless precision. Legends claim he killed 99 brothers, sparing only one. The truth may be less, but the scale of bloodshed is undeniable. Ashoka earned the name Chandashoka, Ashoka, the Cruel. His hands were drenched with family blood before he ever touched a crown. Once seated on the throne, he ruled with iron. Early chronicles describe his eyes as hard as flint, his punishments swift and merciless. Rebels were crushed without pity. Ministers who faltered were executed. Entire families of dissenters vanished overnight. The machinery of poison and daggers, refined under Chanakya and Bindusara, was now Ashoka's tool of domination. But brute force was not his only weapon. Ashoka understood the value of fear. Torture chambers were built, most infamous among them, the Hell of Ashoka, a palace disguised as paradise, but in truth, a house of torment. Invited guests were shown lush gardens and golden halls. But once inside, they were trapped, tortured, and executed by the emperor's orders. To some it was myth, to others memory. But the message was clear. Defy Ashoka, and suffer in ways that would echo beyond death. His empire spread vast, but his hunger for conquest pushed further still. And so came the war that would change everything, Kalinga. Kalinga was a proud kingdom on the eastern coast of India, rich in trade and fiercely independent. Ashoka marched against it with hundreds of thousands, infantry, cavalry, elephants in armor, chariots gleaming in the sun. The earth shook with the weight of his armies. The war was brutal beyond imagination. Chroniclers describe rivers running red, battlefields choked with corpses, elephants trampling men like straw. By the end, 100,000 lay dead, countless more enslaved or driven into exile. The fields of Kalinga were not only conquered, they were annihilated. It was victory. And yet it broke him. As Ashoka walked the battlefield, the air thick with the stench of death, he saw not triumph but ruin, mothers wailing over lifeless sons, children wandering amid corpses, the silence of a people extinguished. For the first time, the weight of his cruelty fell upon him. He, who had murdered brothers without hesitation, who had built palaces of torture, now saw the full measure of what bloodshed could do. That night, Ashoka could not sleep. The cries of the dying haunted him. The faces of the slain would not fade. Victory had given him an empire, but it had stripped him of his soul. And so began the transformation. From Chandashoka, the cruel, he would become Dharmashoka, the righteous. From poison and daggers, he would turn to the teachings of the Buddha. From an emperor feared for his cruelty, he would become a king remembered for his mercy. But the shadow of his past never vanished. His name would always carry the echo of those massacres, the silent reminder that even the greatest saints of history are born from blood. Philippi had silenced the daggers of Brutus and Cassius, but it did not silence ambition. With the liberators dead, Rome belonged to the victors, Antony and Octavian. Yet the Republic's corpse could not shelter two masters for long. At first, the second triumvirate seemed secure. Antony ruled the east, where the wealth of Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor flowed. Octavian controlled the west, including Italy, where he courted the Senate and the people. Lepidus, the third man, quickly faded into irrelevance, a shadow beside two rising giants. Antony, soldier and statesman, was bold, charismatic, and reckless. Octavian was cold, calculating, and patient, a spider spinning his web in silence. Between them, Rome trembled, waiting to see who would seize ultimate power. And then came Cleopatra, the queen of Egypt, dazzling and dangerous, had already tangled with Caesar in her youth, bearing him a son. Now she bound herself to Antony. To some, it was love. To others, strategy. Cleopatra offered Antony wealth, ships, and influence. In return, Antony offered her protection and legitimacy. Together, they envisioned not merely ruling Rome, but reshaping the Mediterranean world. Octavian seized on this alliance, twisting it into a weapon. In Rome, he spread whispers. Antony had fallen under the spell of a foreign queen. He no longer lived as a Roman, but as an Eastern monarch, dining in golden palaces, calling himself Dionysus reborn. Worst of all, Antony had promised gifts of Roman provinces to Cleopatra's children. To Octavian, this was treason. To the Roman people, it was unthinkable. Propaganda filled the streets. Coins bore Octavian's image beside slogans of Roman virtue. Poems mocked Antony as Cleopatra's slave. In the Forum, Octavian raised his voice as the defender of Rome against Eastern corruption. He presented Caesar's will, stolen from the Vestal Virgins, which revealed Antony's intentions for Cleopatra's dynasty. Whether truth or forgery, it ignited fury. Rome's loyalty tilted. Senators who once admired Antony turned cold. The people who had loved Caesar's generosity now saw in Antony a traitor. Octavian had played his game well. By 32 BC, the alliance shattered. The Senate declared war not on Antony himself, but on Cleopatra, a masterstroke of Octavian's propaganda. It was not civil war, they claimed, but a foreign war against an Egyptian queen. In truth, it was Rome against itself. Yet the illusion gave Octavian moral ground. The climax came at Actium in 31 BC. On the western coast of Greece, Antony and Cleopatra assembled their fleet. Hundreds of ships, sleek and gilded, a floating palace of war. Opposite them, Octavian's admiral Agrippa commanded Rome's navy with ruthless skill. The battle raged with fire and oars, the sea choking with smoke and broken timbers. Antony's ships were vast but unwieldy, Octavian's smaller and more agile. For hours the clash thundered. Then, in the midst of chaos, Cleopatra's ships suddenly broke away, fleeing with their treasure. Seeing her sails retreat, Antony abandoned the fight, chasing after her. His fleet collapsed, leaderless, consumed by Agrippa's disciplined assault. The sea turned red, and Antony's cause sank beneath the waves. Rome watched in disbelief. The man who had once commanded legions across the world had deserted his own battle for the Queen of Egypt. His honor shattered, his power gone, Antony became a fugitive. In the aftermath, Octavian marched unchallenged. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Alexandria, their kingdom shrinking, their hopes fading. For Octavian, the path was clear. With Antony destroyed, he would stand alone as the master of Rome, and in the shadows, the Republic, once again, breathed its last. The waves at Actium had swallowed Antony's fate, but his final act would play out on land, in the shimmering palaces of Alexandria. After the battle, Antony and Cleopatra fled south, retreating into the golden halls of Egypt. Once their union had dazzled the Mediterranean world. Now it was a cage of despair. Cleopatra still glittered in silks and jewels, but her throne trembled. Antony, once Rome's fiercest general, now wandered in gloom, his pride broken, his legions gone. Octavian moved with cold precision. He marched into Egypt, his armies cutting off escape. Alexandria braced for the storm. Its streets bustled with fear, its harbour filled with smoke. Cleopatra retreated to her mausoleum, a fortress of stone built not only for treasures, but for death, a tomb she had prepared for herself. Antony, Hearing rumors that Cleopatra had taken her life to avoid capture was undone. Believing her dead, he could not endure the shame of defeat. Calling upon a loyal servant, he drove his own sword into his body. Yet fate played cruel tricks. He did not die instantly. As he bled, news arrived. Cleopatra still lived. With failing strength, Antony ordered himself carried to her. Wounded and pale, he was hoisted into her mausoleum, lifted through a window, and laid beside the queen he had loved. Blood pooled between them as he whispered his last words, urging her to trust no one, to preserve her dignity in death. Then, the conqueror of legions breathed his last, dying not as a Roman hero on the battlefield, but as a lover broken by fate. Cleopatra remained. Octavian entered Alexandria, offering her life if she would submit. But the Queen of Egypt, daughter of pharaohs, would not march in chains through the streets of Rome as a trophy. She dined one final time, dressed in her royal robes, and entered her tomb with 2 attendants. There, legend says, she clasped an asp, a serpent hidden in a basket of figs, to her breast. The venom coursed through her veins, burning and numbing, until she lay still upon her golden couch. Her attendants followed her into death. Whether it was truly the asp, a poisoned ointment, or a hidden blade, none can say. What mattered was the act. Cleopatra chose death over humiliation. When Octavian entered her chamber, he found her lifeless, a crown still upon her head. The last pharaoh of Egypt had written her final chapter in her own blood. With Antony and Cleopatra gone, Octavian stood unchallenged. He returned to Rome not as a general seeking honors, but as the master of the world. The Senate, broken and tamed, offered him titles. Augustus, the revered one. He accepted modestly, cloaking his power in the language of tradition. But beneath the humility, the truth was clear. The Republic was dead. No longer did daggers in the Senate decide Rome's fate. The throne had shifted from many to one. Rome had a princeps, a first citizen, who was in truth an emperor. Augustus wrapped his rule in old words, but his power was absolute. The dream of the Republic had bled out at Pompey's statue with Caesar and been buried at Philippi with Brutus. And yet, the daggers never vanished. They still gleamed in the shadows, waiting in the hands of Praetorian guards, ambitious generals, and jealous courtiers. Rome had traded civil wars for imperial assassinations, traded liberty for stability, but the cycle of betrayal was eternal. For in Rome, as in Persia, as in India, power was never safe. The Ides of March had shown that even the greatest could fall, and the lesson would echo for centuries. Emperors would rise, emperors would die, and more often than not, their deaths would not come from enemies abroad, but from blades drawn close to home. The Republic was gone, the Empire had begun, and with it, a new theatre for assassination was opened. A stage where emperors themselves would learn the fear Caesar once knew. The story of India's hidden blades is a story of contradiction. On one hand stood the gleaming pillars of Ashoka, carved with words of compassion. "All men are my children." These inscriptions rose across the land, standing in marketplaces, by roadsides in distant provinces. They were the voice of a king who had once been a butcher but had turned to peace. They promised tolerance, justice, and mercy, and yet in the very same cities where these pillars shone in the sun, poison still brewed in dark kitchens. Courtesans still whispered secrets into the ears of princes. Ministers still kept hidden vials in their robes, ready to tip the balance of power with a single drop. Behind the public words of Dharma, private hands carried daggers. This was the paradox of the Mauryan world. It was an empire that spoke of peace while practicing betrayal, that dreamed of compassion while sharpening blades. And it was this paradox that outlived Ashoka himself. The Mauryan dynasty collapsed not in one sudden fall, but in a slow erosion of trust. Each assassination carved away at its foundation. Each betrayal weakened its walls. By the time the last Mauryan king sat on the throne, the empire was already a hollow shell, a golden crown with no head strong enough to hold it. But the culture of assassination, that survived. The Arthashastra, with its cold advice to poison rivals, to seduce enemies with courtesans, to silence dissent with daggers in the night, it did not vanish with the Mauryas. It became part of India's political DNA, whispered from one dynasty to the next. Later, kings studied it, not as history, but as a handbook, Gupta emperors, Deccan rulers, Rajput courts, all kept alive the old art of silent killing. Vishakanyas was spoken of with fear long after the Mauryans were gone. Assassins and spies thrived wherever there was power to be taken, and so India's contribution to the long saga of assassination was unique. Here, killing was not always brute force, but subtle, intimate, entwined with beauty and seduction. Where Rome would stab openly in the Senate, India killed with silk and wine, with the touch of a maiden, with the advice of a minister cloaked in learning. The legacy of India's hidden blades is not just in history books, it is in the eternal truth it revealed. That power is never safe, that kings are never secure, and that thrones are always surrounded not just by guards, but by daggers waiting in the dark. When Alexander burned Persepolis, it seemed Persia had ended in fire. When Ashoka carved his edicts, it seemed India had turned to peace. But both empires told the same story. Empires fall not when enemies invade, but when trust within collapses. And beyond India, the pattern would repeat. In Rome, senators sharpened knives for Caesar. In Byzantium, emperors were strangled in their sleep. Across the world, power and betrayal danced their endless dance. The Mauryan story fades into shadows, but the lesson of India's hidden blades endures. No king, no emperor, no dynasty is ever safe from those closest to them. For sometimes, the deadliest enemy is not at the gates, but at the table. Chapter 6. Daggers in Rome. The city of Rome did not glitter like Persepolis, nor chant like the courts of India. It thundered. Its streets echoed with the clatter of sandals, the shouts of merchants, the clash of gladiators in the arena, the tramp of legions returning in triumph. Marble temples rose above the forum. Senators in togas argued under painted ceilings, and banners of victory hung across the streets. But beneath the roar of the Republic, betrayal beat like a hidden drum. Rome prided itself on law and order, on the majesty of its Senate, on the discipline of its armies. And yet, when ambition flared, when fear grew sharp, Rome too reached for the dagger. From the earliest days of the Republic, political murder stalked the city. Tribunes who challenged the Senate were struck down. Generals who grew too powerful were removed before they could crown themselves kings. The Romans hated the word rex, king, but their history showed that they were willing to kill anyone who seemed to reach for it. The Gracchi brothers were among the first victims of this political paranoia. Tiberius Gracchus, a reformer who sought to give land back to the poor, was bludgeoned to death by senators on the very steps of the Capitol in 133 BC. His brother Gaius followed years later, hunted down by mobs, cornered and killed in the streets. Their blood spilled into the stones of Rome, a warning to anyone who dared challenge the elite. But the Gracchi were only the beginning. Rome's politics became a battlefield without honor. Marius and Sulla, once allies, turned into enemies. Their rivalry filled the streets with corpses, proscription lists nailed to the forum walls, names of citizens marked for death, their property confiscated, their lives forfeit. Thousands died. Senators, knights, even common men, struck down not by foreign invaders, but by fellow Romans. Rome had begun to devour itself, and from this chaos rose Julius Caesar. Tall, charismatic, brilliant in both war and politics, Caesar was adored by the people and feared by the Senate. His conquests in Gaul had filled Rome with treasure and glory. His legions loved him with a loyalty that bordered on worship. And when he crossed the Rubicon in 49 BC, defying the Senate's orders, civil war erupted once more. For years, Rome bled as Caesar battled Pompey the Great and his allies. Battles raged from Italy to Greece, from Africa to Spain. In the end, Pompey fell, his head severed in Egypt, and Caesar returned to Rome as master of the Republic. But victory brought danger. Caesar was no ordinary general returning home. He accepted honors without precedent, dictator perpetuo, dictator for life. He wore the laurel crown as though it were a king's diadem. He sat on a golden chair in the Senate, a place no man had dared before. The word rex, king, began to whisper through Rome's streets. And for Romans, the memory of their last king, Tarquin the Proud, still burned like a scar. To them, kingship was tyranny, chains, humiliation. They had sworn centuries earlier that no man would ever rule them as king again. And yet here was Caesar, adored by the people, commanding the legions, bending the Senate to his will. Fear spread, ambition stirred, and daggers began to sharpen. The Senate feared him, the people adored him, the legions would follow him to the ends of the earth. Julius Caesar had risen beyond the limits of a Roman statesman, and that was exactly the problem. Rome prided itself on being a republic, where no man was above the law, no crown could weigh on a single head. But Caesar now walked through the forum as though it belonged to him alone. He sat in the Senate on a throne-like chair, received honors usually reserved for gods, and even allowed his image to be minted on coins while still alive, a privilege that whispered of monarchy. For some, this was glory. For others, it was treason. Among those who trembled at Caesar's rise was Marcus Junius Brutus, a man of noble lineage, descended from the Brutus who had once driven out Rome's last king. His very blood carried the legacy of resistance to tyranny. Yet Brutus was no mere rebel. He had fought beside Caesar, dined at his table, and even been treated as a son. Some whispered he was Caesar's illegitimate child, though history left that rumor in shadow. What mattered was that Brutus was torn between loyalty to a man he admired and loyalty to the republic that demanded Caesar's death. Beside him stood Cassius, sharper, colder, less conflicted. Cassius despised Caesar's rise, resented his arrogance, and hungered for his fall. It was Cassius who whispered into Brutus's ear, reminding him of his ancestry, urging him to act. "Will you watch Rome kneel to a king?" Cassius pressed. "Or will you rise as your forefathers did?" One by one, senators joined the plot. They met in secret, away from the marble halls, in dimly lit houses, whispering over wax tablets. 60 men in all. Senators, statesmen, former allies, bound by a single oath. Caesar must die. But how? They could not strike him in the streets. The people would riot. They could not kill him in his home. His guards would intervene. No, they needed a place where Caesar would be vulnerable, where the majesty of the Republic itself would cloak their deed. And so, they chose the Senate. The date was set, the Ides of March, the 15th day of the month. In the days leading up to it, omens filled Rome. A soothsayer warned Caesar, "Beware the Ides of March." His wife Calpurnia dreamed of his statue bleeding as Romans washed their hands in it. Sacrifices revealed bad signs, lightning split the sky. Even as he prepared to leave his house that morning, Caesar hesitated. Calpurnia clutched his hand, begging him to stay. For a moment, it seemed fate itself might be delayed. Caesar agreed to postpone his appearance at the Senate. But then came Decimus, one of the conspirators, a man Caesar trusted deeply. With careful words, he mocked the idea of fear. "The Senate waits for you," he urged. "Will you insult them by staying home? Will you appear weak before men who already murmur of kingship?" Caesar, proud, relented. Escorted by friends and enemies alike, he walked through the forum toward the theatre of Pompey, where the Senate was meeting that day. The irony was cruel. Pompey, his old rival, had fallen to Caesar, and now within Pompey's hall, Caesar would meet his own death. The conspirators waited, daggers hidden in their togas, faces calm, voices polite. When Caesar entered, they rose in respect, welcoming him like loyal senators. None betrayed a flicker of intent. As he sat, the trap was sprung. Tilius Cimber approached, clutching a petition. He begged Caesar to recall his exiled brother. When Caesar refused, Cimber grew bolder, seizing Caesar's toga and pulling it from his hall. Casca struck first, his blade scraping across Caesar's neck. Caesar turned, grappling with him, crying out, "Casca, you villain, what are you doing?" But already more daggers were drawn. Blades plunged into his body, arms, chest, back. Senators he had promoted, men he had trusted, drove steel into his flesh. He staggered, trying to resist, but the blows came too quickly, too many. Blood spattered across the marble floor, across the senator's robes. The chamber rang, not with debate, but with gasps, screams, and the wet sound of knives in flesh. And then came Brutus. When Caesar saw him, the man he had trusted, perhaps even loved, his strength faltered. Ancient writers say he whispered, "Et tu, Brute?" "You too, Brutus." Whether he spoke those exact words or not, the moment was real. With Brutus's betrayal, the fight drained from him. He pulled his toga over his head, covering his face, and collapsed at the foot of Pompey's statue. The conqueror of Gaul, the master of Rome, The man who had defied kings and armies lay dead in a pool of his own blood, cut by more than 20 wounds. Rome, once again, had killed its own king, or at least the man it feared might become one. The Senate chamber stank of blood. Julius Caesar's body lay crumpled at the base of Pompey's statue, his toga drenched, his face hidden. Around him, the conspirators stood panting, blades still slick, robes spattered red. Silence fell, heavy, unnatural. For a heartbeat, none moved. 60 men had raised daggers, but none felt the triumph they had expected. The air was thick, not with victory, but with dread. Cassius broke first. He lifted his bloodied hand, raised it high, and cried, "Thus perish all tyrants!" His voice rang hollow, desperate, as though he needed to convince himself. Brutus followed, calling out to the senators who had not joined the attack. "Romans, we are free!" he declared, his words echoing through the chamber. Not Caesar, but the Republic rules again. But the faces around him were pale, horrified. Senators slipped away, unwilling to be seen either as loyalists or traitors. The chamber that had once thundered with debates emptied like a haunted house. The conspirators stumbled out into the forum, still clutching their daggers, their hands sticky with blood. They lifted them toward the sky, shouting to the crowd, "People of Rome, we have slain a tyrant. We are saviors of the Republic." But the people did not cheer. They stared in shock, in fear, in silence. Some fled, some muttered prayers, some wept. For all Caesar's ambition, he had been beloved by the masses. He had given them land, bread, and spectacle. He had led them to victory, and now he was dead, not struck by foreign enemies, but butchered by those who called themselves guardians of liberty. The conspirators had dreamed of being hailed as heroes. Instead, they saw only suspicion. In the days that followed, Rome teetered. The assassins, Brutus, Cassius, Decimus, and the others, tried to frame Caesar's death as liberation. They gave speeches in the forum, reminding the crowd of Caesar's arrogance, his dictatorship for life, his hints of kingship. They expected applause. Instead, the people muttered angrily. Some demanded vengeance. Others clung to silence, waiting to see which way the winds would blow. Then came the funeral. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general and consul, delivered the oration. The conspirators had allowed it, believing Antony harmless, believing his words would calm the crowd. But Antony was no fool. He understood the theatre of grief. He stood before Caesar's corpse, the body displayed on a bier. He spoke softly at first, calling Brutus and Cassius honourable men. His voice trembled with restraint, his words laced with irony. Then, with each sentence, his tone sharpened, his grief grew louder, until the crowd leaned in, breathless. And then he revealed Caesar's wounds. He lifted the toga, showing the rents torn by daggers. "Look, Romans," he cried, "here is where Casca struck. See, here is the gash Brutus made. Judge for yourselves what honour is in these men." The crowd erupted, their silence shattered. Antony stoked the fire, reading Caesar's will aloud, how he had left money and land to the people of Rome. The mob wept, then raged. By the time Antony was finished, the forum was in chaos. The people surged toward the conspirators' homes, torches in hand. Statues of Brutus and Cassius were torn down. The dream of being hailed as liberators dissolved into the reality of being hunted as murderers. Rome burned with fury. Brutus and Cassius fled the city, gathering forces in the provinces. But already the tide had turned. Antony, wielding Caesar's memory like a weapon, aligned himself with Octavian, Caesar's young heir. Together they promised vengeance. The death of one man had not restored the Republic. It had doomed it. The Ides of March, meant to save Rome, had only opened the gates of civil war, and the Republic, already fragile, would not survive the storm. The blood of Caesar had not restored the Republic. It had poisoned it. Brutus and Cassius, fleeing from the fury of Rome's people, tried to rebuild their image in the provinces. They called themselves liberatores, the liberators of Rome. In speeches, they spoke of freedom, of the Republic reborn, but their words rang hollow. Wherever they went, Caesar's shadow followed. The people remembered his victories, his generosity, his bread and circuses. To many, he was not a tyrant slain, but a father betrayed. Meanwhile, in Rome, Caesar's heirs moved swiftly. Mark Antony, the veteran general, stood as Caesar's closest ally, but beside him rose an unlikely figure, Gaius Octavius, Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and heir, barely 19, pale and sickly, but burning with ambition. Where Antony had strength, Octavian had cunning. And together, despite their rivalry, they formed an alliance with Marcus Lepidus, creating the Second Triumvirate. Their purpose was vengeance. Rome soon saw a new horror: proscriptions. Lists of names were nailed once more to the forum walls, just as in the days of Sulla. Senators, knights, merchants, anyone suspected of opposing the triumvirs, was marked for death. Their property was seized, their families disgraced. Soldiers and bounty hunters prowled the streets, cutting down men in broad daylight. Cicero, Rome's greatest orator, fell in this purge. His hands and head were nailed to the rostra where once his voice had guided the Republic. Blood stained the city once again, and the Republic bled out with it. Brutus and Cassius, gathering forces in the east, knew the reckoning was coming. They amassed legions in Greece, their banners raised not for freedom but for survival. Antony and Octavian marched to meet them, their armies swelling with Caesar's veterans, men who thirsted for revenge. The clash came at Philippi in 42 BC. Two titanic battles shook the plains of Macedonia. In the first, Brutus's forces struck hard, scattering Octavian's troops. Cassius, on the other wing, faltered, overwhelmed by Antony's veterans. Mistaking the chaos for total defeat, Cassius despaired. From a hilltop, he looked upon the dust of battle, convinced Brutus had been destroyed. In despair, he called upon a loyal slave to strike him down. Cassius, the mind that had plotted Caesar's murder, died by his own hand. Undone not by Antony, but by despair and misjudgment. Brutus fought on, leading his legions with desperate brilliance. For weeks he held the line, rallying men who still believed in the Republic. But Antony and Octavian pressed harder, their numbers greater, their veterans relentless. In the final clash, Brutus's army was broken, his camp overrun. Surrounded, he fled into the hills. There, beneath the trees, he too chose death. Calling upon his companions, he thrust his sword into the earth and fell upon it. As the steel pierced him, he whispered that he had been loyal to the Republic to the end. With his blood, the last true hope of the Republic seeped into the ground. Philippi was not a victory for liberty, it was its funeral. The daggers that had killed Caesar had been meant to save the Republic, but in truth, they had destroyed it. With Brutus and Cassius gone, Antony and Octavian stood as masters of Rome. The Senate was no longer a guardian of freedom, but a theatre for the ambitions of warlords. The Republic was dead, but its corpse still twitched. For Antony and Octavian were not destined to rule together forever. Their alliance was fragile, bound by vengeance, doomed by ambition. Rome had traded the dagger of assassination for the sword of civil war. And soon, it would see another struggle, one that would decide whether the Republic's ghost would fade forever into empire. The fields of Kalinga were still scarred when Ashoka emerged from the shadows of his own brutality. Victory had given him dominion, but the weight of 100,000 corpses dragged his spirit into despair. He could no longer escape the cries of the dying. They followed him into the throne room, into his sleep, into his waking hours, and so, in the quiet that followed the blood, Ashoka turned towards something no Mauryan king before him had embraced, the path of renunciation. He sought the teachings of the Buddha, not the distant tales of gods and sacrifices, but the words of a man who had spoken of suffering, of compassion, of the middle way. Ashoka found in them a balm for the wounds of his soul. Where once he had ordered daggers and poison, now he ordered inscriptions carved on stone pillars, declaring his new devotion to Dharma, the law of righteousness. He banned animal sacrifices in his court. He spoke of tolerance for all sects and respect for all faiths. He built stupas, monasteries, and roads to spread the teachings of peace. His empire, once ruled by fear, was reshaped into a realm of morality and compassion, at least in appearance. But beneath the surface, the old shadows lingered. For though Ashoka had renounced violence, the world around him had not. The Mauryan court still thrummed with intrigue. Princes still schemed, ministers still plotted, and poison still whispered through banquets. Spies still worked in marketplaces, and assassins still sharpened their blades. Ashoka's conversion did not erase the machinery of power that had built the empire. It only redirected it. Some courtiers doubted his sincerity. They whispered that his transformation was weakness, that his empire would crumble if he abandoned the tools of fear. Enemies outside his borders tested his resolve, probing with raids and defiance. And even within his family, danger stirred. His sons and grandsons did not inherit his vision of Dharma with the same fervor. Some resisted, some betrayed. Inscriptions tell us he sent his son Mahinda and daughter Sangamita to spread Buddhism in Sri Lanka. Yet other sons turned against him, hungering for the throne. Rebellion was never far, even in the empire of a righteous king. The old poisons returned in subtle ways. Rivals who spoke too boldly of Ashoka's weakness sometimes vanished. Ministers who pressed too hard against his reforms found themselves quietly removed. No blood was spilled openly, but shadows whispered of the same ancient tactics Chanakya had once taught. Eliminate threats before they grow. Ashoka's dream was vast. To replace fear with faith, to replace daggers with Dharma. And yet, the machinery of assassination, perfected through generations, could not simply vanish. It remained in the hands of those who did not share his vision, waiting for his death. Still, in his lifetime, Ashoka's transformation was real. He carved his remorse into stone so the world would never forget. "All men are my children," he declared, a startling confession from a king who had once butchered thousands. His edicts spoke of compassion, of non-violence, of moral duty, but the paradox was inescapable. His voice carried weight because his empire had been built with blood. The peace he preached was only possible because of the poison and daggers that had secured his throne. When Ashoka finally died, the empire trembled once again. Without his iron hand, the ideals of Dharma weakened. Intrigue returned in full. Assassinations whispered back into the light. Within 50 years, the Mauryan Empire began to crumble, consumed by the same shadows that had haunted its birth. Ashoka's legacy endured, but it carried two faces. To the faithful, he was the righteous king, the spreader of Buddhism, the apostle of peace. To those who remembered his youth, he was still Chandashoka, the butcher. And in truth, he was both. Proof that even the greatest kings of peace are born from the knives and poisons of history. The hidden blades of India did not die with him. They passed on, sharper than ever, waiting in the hands of courtiers, queens, and assassins who knew that while Dharma might rule men's hearts, daggers ruled their thrones. When Ashoka closed his eyes for the last time, his empire was still vast, his edicts carved across stone pillars from Afghanistan to Sri Lanka. But the moment his body grew cold, the shadows returned. Without the weight of his personality, the ideals of Dharma could not hold the empire together. His sons and grandsons fought like jackals over the corpse of Maurya power. Provinces broke free. Generals carved their own fiefdoms. Ministers switched loyalties with the shifting winds. The empire that had once seemed eternal began to splinter, not because of foreign armies, but because of betrayal within. It began, as it always did, in the palace. Princes quarreled for succession. Those too weak to win openly reached for poison. Servants carried cups of milk and wine laced with venom. Dishes of rice and curry were salted not with spice, but with powders that burned through the body in hours. Brothers died at feasts. Nephews disappeared in the night. A single banquet could wipe out half a dynasty. Some chronicles suggest that within just 50 years of Ashoka's death, 7 Mauryan kings rose and fell in rapid succession. Few died peacefully. Many were murdered by ministers, others by their own kin. Each death weakened the empire further, until the Mauryan name was more curse than crown. The harem, too, remained a battlefield. Queens plotted for their sons, wielding poison with the same subtlety Paracetes once had in Persia. Courtesans, trained as weapons, whispered into ears, delivered fatal touches, and passed secrets from bedchambers to ministers. The Vishakanyas did not vanish with Ashoka's reforms. They adapted, serving new masters in the chaos that followed. The ministers grew bolder. Where once they had served kings, now they decided who would be king. A dynasty of assassins replaced the dynasty of emperors. Kingship became a revolving door, each ruler seated on the throne, already marked for death. In the provinces, governors declared independence. Without fear of Ashoka's iron hand, they used the same tools of intrigue to consolidate their rule. Poison and daggers were as common as swords, for no man trusted another. Loyalty was not to crown or Dharma, but to survival. The Mauryan collapse was not a single event, but a slow bleeding out. Every assassination cut a vein of the empire. Every betrayal drained its strength. By the time foreign invaders pressed at its borders, the empire was already hollow, its kings too busy watching their cups of wine to raise armies in time. Yet the culture of assassination did not die with the Mauryas. It survived, flowing like a poison into the veins of the next kingdoms. The Gupta court, centuries later, would inherit the same whispers, the same courtesan spies, the same hidden daggers. The Arthashastra, though written in the Mauryan age, was copied, preserved, and studied by later rulers, who saw in it a handbook not only for ruling, but for killing. Ashoka had tried to cover the empire in Dharma, but blood always seeped through the cracks. His pillars still stood, carved with words of peace, but in the same cities where they rose, assassins still stalked the night. The contradiction became India's inheritance. Ideals of compassion, practiced in temples and preached in courts, and shadows of poison and betrayal, practiced behind palace walls. The fall of the Mauryas proved one truth above all. Empires do not collapse because of enemies at their gates. They collapse because of daggers in their courts. And in India, those daggers were sharpened long before Alexander came, and they would remain sharp long after the Mauryans were dust. The hidden blades had not vanished. They had only passed on, waiting for the next dynasty, the next court, the next king foolish enough to believe he could sit safely upon a throne.